Well, many thanks to you for this very generous presentation. It's indeed a pleasure to give my first African paper. I hope that it's not going to be my last one, but you will be the judges of that. I will not be talking about Africa specifically today, but I do think that the story I want to tell you needs to have an African chapter, so this is something we may want to consider during the discussion. In the last couple of decades, which have been marked by an acute awareness of the process of globalization at the turn of the third millennium, we have come to a new appreciation of the importance of cross-cultural encounters for the formation of European modernity and Western identity, let alone its imperial claims in the 19th and 20th centuries. The paradigm of discovery has increasingly been replaced by one of encounter, and we have learned to supplement the one-sided analysis of discourse with an appreciation of multi-sided interaction. We are also moving beyond self-enclosed regional studies, and some scholars are seeking to adopt a truly global and comparative perspective, distinguishing different areas of the globe in order to, for example, avoid the application of the New World model, the American model, which is actually exceptional in many ways, ecological exception to begin with, elsewhere. We are no longer talking about Europe and the New World, to echo John Eliot's famous book, but rather about Europe's New Worlds, which is precisely the title of the book that I have been writing over the last 10 years. And what I'm going to do today is to present a kind of summary of the main ideas of that book, in addition to the introduction of the book. There remains, nevertheless, a real danger of reading back into the early modern period with the colonial dominance and imperial claims of later centuries. In fact, as recent scholarship has emphasized, early modern colonial ventures were not always equally imperial. There are different kinds of imperialism. There is also a questioning of imperialism in the European Enlightenment. Some of you may have read, for example, Sankar Mutu's Enlightenment against Empire. A move away from monolithic East-West or East and West dichotomies is part of the solution. Another part of the task ahead is to define what is distinctive of the early modern period and its different moments before the height of European imperialism. Following the paradigm of interactions strengthens the case for a nuanced understanding of the various early modern contexts of encounter, because it reveals the production of images of non-European cultures as something more complex than a mere justification for empire. I could refer here to my case study that has already been referred to, on the formation and transformation of images of South India throughout a long Renaissance, as an example of how the logic of knowledge production was driven by interactions with, as well as misunderstandings of of other cultures, rather than by mere projection of European aims and ideologies. There is a lot of local negotiation of knowledge, to put it differently, local negotiation of knowledge at the source of many of the accounts of other cultures that will then make their way into Europe. However, understanding the complexity of the production of ethnographic knowledge is only part of the task. Another crucial issue, and this is the one that I'm turning to at the moment, is the reception of this ethnographic knowledge within European intellectual culture. To what extent was the perception of cultural diversity, the diversity of laws, religions, customs, and forms of government, as early modern writers said, to what extent was this cultural diversity transformed by the impact of travel writing and connected genres? To what extent was the Enlightenment as such ethnographically informed? I mean, the Enlightenment is the crux of my argument. I see the Enlightenment as something that is still with us today in the agenda for international culture. after globalization. So it is, therefore, my interest is to talk about the origins of the Enlightenment and its relation to travel writing. We can later on discuss the problems, the paradoxes, which I will refer to in my book, of having a kind of Eurocentric tradition at the heart of cultural globalization. But my argument is that it's not so Eurocentric to begin with. There is today, I believe, a large scholarly consensus concerning the importance of early modern ethnography. The fact that travel writing was an important part of the culture of the Enlightenment, that it exerted some impact on the philosophers like Voltaire and so is beyond dispute. Because it's obvious that any 18th century philosopher who was writing about politics or religion or history had to talk about other peoples than were Europeans. There was absolutely no one who dared to say anything meaningful, except a few theologians. There was nothing informed by that. That is the question. That is the etymology. That any early modern library was full of shelves with accounts of South Africa, the Americas, China, Japan, India, Persia, the Ottoman Empire, and many other places. That is part of what the Enlightenment is like, to read about these places. However, I suspect that until quite recently, this widely shared consensus about the importance of these genres has been taken for granted without rigorous analysis of what it really means. One still reads, for example, in a popular handbook on the Enlightenment that only in the 18th century was exploration regarded as a primary source of knowledge, relegating the ethnographic production of the previous centuries as a mere byproduct of voyages primarily aimed at loot and booty. Now, this is the kind of thing I'd like to question. More deeply problematic is the statement that the central failure of the Enlightenment is the way it dealt with difference, because it could not grapple with the idea that each cultural entity followed its own separate dynamic, emphasizing instead a single grand movement of progress. Now, to be fair, Dorinda Outram, this is from whom all these statements come, has been revising this claim in later writings. But I think that this is symptomatic of the way that the field is changing. Far from being a marginal concern with exotic, encounters with non-European peoples are now in the mainstream of a reassessment of the Enlightenment and its legacy. In effect, our understanding of the Enlightenment has been transformed. We no longer believe that there was one Enlightenment based on the idea of progress, the core doctrine of progress, but rather a plurality of views, often hotly contested. Some scholars, most famously perhaps Israel, continue to insist that there is an ideological center to the Enlightenment, which in his particular version is radical, Spinozist, and Republican. And then there are forms of resistance to those radical doctrines. However, in my view, it makes much more sense to accept the ideological plurality of the Enlightenment. This is not only about emphasizing, for example, the many alternatives to Spinozism, which were not simply reactions to it, but also the different ways that the same works, for example, Rousseau's second discourse or his social contract, could be read in different regional or national contexts. What is then the Enlightenment? If we abandon one core idea or set of ideas and emphasize diverse views and different perceptions, I think it can be defined through a series of debates and modes of knowledge, which, among other things, make possible the emergence and popularization of the radical ideas that Joan-Pau Rubiès has emphasized. The contribution of ethnographic knowledge, then, finds a natural place in this process because it is one of the modes of knowledge which are also conditions of possibility for many of the debates of the Enlightenment about human nature and history. Now, before I continue criticizing other scholars and making enemies perhaps, let me pay homage to a number of scholars, many French scholars in fact, who identified this subject I'm talking about many decades ago. in the early 20th century, there was a number of books by Gilbert Chinard, Jeffrey Atkinson, Gilles Pinot, and most eminently Paul Hazard, La crise de la conscience européenne, who saw the importance of this subject. However, all these poems had one problem. All these books had one problem, which was that they were Francocentric. I mean, basically, they used France as the center of the Enlightenment. On the other hand, early modern travel writing is not only multicultural in its conditions of production, but also fundamentally a multinational genre in its circulation and impact. In addition, it must be said that Paul Hazard's chronology was too limited. Not Jeffrey Atkinson, and there were others who had already written the Renaissance, but there was a tendency to focus on the late 17th, early 18th century by Paul Hazard. And I think that the proper appreciation of how we get to the Enlightenment views of pornography requires looking back to the whole of the 16th century. So if we are to consider the high Enlightenment of the middle of the 18th century as a point of arrival for a number of debates and perspectives that provided the framework for a radical rethinking of human diversity, above all through a new history of civilization, which was ethnographically informed and anthropologically secular, then we must look back to the various genres of travel writing of the previous 2.5 centuries as one of its conditions of possibility. That is kind of my key thesis. Now, one way of tracing the impact of travel writing on the Enlightenment is to focus on a number of key authors and how they read travel accounts, how they used travel accounts. There exist already contributions to this. Going back, for example, to Muriel Dodge's study about how Montesquieu used travel accounts for his Esprit de Melos. More recently, we have books by Jacques Pereira, who has worked on how China became crucial to the way Montesquieu thought about politics. Rolando Minuto has analyzed, how Montesquieu annotated a number of travel accounts, for example, François Bernier on India, or my own assessment some years ago about how Montesquieu owed a great deal to François Bernier in his analysis of despotism, the concept of despotism, which is a central concept of the political philosophy of Montesquieu. Now, these are obvious cases. Montesquieu, Diderot, and his supplement to the Voyageur of Bougainville, based on semi-fictional discussion with Tahitian. These are kind of obvious examples. Others are less obvious, but no less important. John Locke. John Locke does not refer very much to non-European peoples in his account of liberty, although he does mention occasionally some issues. However, we do know now, thanks to a number of historians like Daniel Carey, that he thought very carefully and read a lot, so that even though it does not appear to be built upon reading about other cultures, his thought is informed by that. In particular, his attack upon the idea in making beers, one of John Locke's philosophical statements, that ideas are not innate but all based on experience, which had huge implications for the way natural laws are understood. Is natural law something that people know instinctively or through experience? But that is something that he very much built upon, being able to argue that there was no universal understanding of natural law. Locke's methodological probabilism may be set in contrast to the casual manner in which a few decades later Jean-Jacques Rousseau would approach the texts that gave him access to information about carrots and Hottentots, that is the poetry, which were to play such an important role in his minimalist reconstruction of the primitive stage of mankind, subsequent to the state of nature in his second discourse. That is to say, the stage, according to Rousseau, when natural man had acquired the rudiments of language and sociability, but not yet the full moral corruption of civilization. Another case we're informed of is the case of Pierre Pale, which again confirms that travelers' ethnography was substantially important in shaping the thought of one of the key critics of religion, and in particular of superstition, in the late 17th century. For example, the idea that you could be ethically good without religious morality, a very scandalous idea in the context of Christian Europe, was built upon the example of the supposed atheism of the Chinese, which the Jesuits had informed Europeans about, although with very different aims. To begin with, of course, the Jesuits were interested in defending the idea that the Chinese could be Confucian and Christian at the same time. But in Europe, in the hands of Pierre Pale, that became something else. It became an argument against Catholicism. Now, if we move away from the libertines like Pale towards more reactionary writers like Leibniz, we again find interest in China. In the case of Leibniz's interest in China has been studied by other authors like Donald Lack and David Mungella. One of the most recent papers on the subject by Franklin Perkins emphasizes the extent to which the philosopher's engagement with Chinese culture was ideologically driven, but not by any desire to claim European superiority, as some naively might expect, but rather by a desire to find a common ground for an exchange of superior teachings. In the sense, Leibniz was a true heir of the Jesuits. He thought that the Chinese philosophy was valid, Confucianism was valid and better than many European philosophies, whilst at the same time believing that Christianity was superior to either Buddhism or Taoism, which were then what Europeans understood to be the religion of China. All this was built on the idea that Confucianism was not a religion, but rather a civil philosophy. This is not something that all Europeans agreed about, but something that they debated about. And finally, of course, Voltaire is another example of someone who used, again, the evidence of China, for example, to build an attack upon biblical claims to being basically at the root of world history. Voltaire, most famously, used China and India and the antiquity of China and India to challenge the idea that the ancient history of the Middle East, and in particular the Jewish account, the Hebrew account of origins, was universally valid. He said, no, the Indians were there well before and civilized well before. Again, this is not a view shared widely within Enlightenment. He is at the radical end of the debate. So again, what I'm emphasizing in all my small examples, I could talk at length about each of them, of course I cannot do it. But what I'm emphasizing is that we don't have one idea of China, or one idea of India, or one idea of Africa in the Enlightenment, but rather a variety of debates around different ideas, with people arguing against each other and using information about China, about India, about Africa, about the Americas as munition, as foundations for those debates. Now, what I'm trying to do is not to offer a catalogue of enlightened thinkers like Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, and say this is kind of what we can see travel writing changing the way they think about things. Rather, what I'm trying to do is to reconstruct the way the genre shaped the field of knowledge, and how this shaping of field of knowledge conditioned the way one could think about history or religion or politics. So what I'm interested in is in the contextual transformation of things and the resulting debates over a succession of works or system of thought. Because travel writing was not only important for the ethnography it produced, but also for the cultural practices that it engendered. Travel became in itself an important educational practice in early modern Europe, from the late medieval pilgrimage to the Grand Tour. And while much exotic travel writing was produced by the practical necessity of commercial, diplomatic, and missionary endeavors, some of the most interesting philosophical travel outside Europe, for example, in the case of Transylvania I referred to, took the form of extended pilgrimages or philosophical quests. Europeans in the 17th century increasingly traveled for the sake of antiquarian, ethnographic, and naturalistic learning. In other words, driven by scientific curiosity. The discourse on travel was, in addition to being a scientific concern, also an important moral concern. From the late 16th century, humanists began to debate whether, when travelers went abroad to broaden their education, and when they learned about other customs and beliefs, whether they actually ended up losing their religious identity and losing their moral compass. By the 17th century, one of the key themes of libertine thought was that people could be improved by cultivating a universal spirit, defining in this way the foundations of a less religious kind of cosmopolitan identity. In other words, the travel writing was not only important in providing information about our cultures, it was also important in shaping practices of collecting data and organizing data, and in shaping the way people thought about changing cultural change, changes in identity. And in particular, it was important in creating a new ideology, a new ideal of cosmopolitanism. Now, one of my aims has been to show the extent to which the interaction between travel literature and humanistic culture shaped the culture of the late Renaissance in decisive ways, creating the grounds for new knowledge practices and, more decisively, transforming empirical ethnography into an authoritative discourse. Despite the fact that, as we have seen, the authenticity of travelers was also contested. And this is another important issue. The traveler's authority grew in the early modern period, but it didn't grow because there was no criticism of the traveler as a potential liar. It grew because there was such criticism of the traveler of potential liar. In that sense, it's important to understand that the authority of the observer who had been there became the cornerstone of the authenticity of the travel account. I did mention the connection with scientific practices. Well, one of the key debates about travel writers was how reliable were travel writers. And in that sense, it may be interesting to compare what happens in Europe, travel writing, to what happens in China. I have very recently been working with a colleague, Professor who was a sinologist, and we have analyzed the way travel writing evolved as a genre in Europe, and how it acquires authority as a foundation for science, human science, and natural science, both can use travelers' accounts as a source of raw material, and how the same genre, a slightly similar genre, evolved in China in the Song and Ming and early Qing periods, and Qing periods. And what we find is that you have a very complex Chinese genre that you can compare to the European genre. Complex means diversity, complex in the quality of its text, in its subjectivity. However, what we don't find is a comparable degree of cultural relevance. The Chinese genre never acquires the capacity to transform philosophical thought or religious thought or scientific practices that the European genre acquires. And that, in part, has to do with the quantity of travel that took place in Europe, because Europeans were then colonizing so many areas of the world. And in many places they were not colonizing, they were just trading. But trading also generated another thing. So that was one of the key differences, the amount of material that was written. But the second key difference, of course, is the way that those materials could be compared and contrasted. If you have one traveler that goes to China in the Middle Ages, like John Mandeville or Marco Polo, you have no way of saying whether that's fiction or reality, because you have one traveler to look at. In fact, Marco Polo did go to China. John Mandeville never went anywhere because he was a fictional figure. But the lay people traveler would never have been able, by reading the text, to figure that out. However, in the 17th century, it is perfectly possible for a reader, travel accounts, to begin to discriminate on the basis of this guy who pretends to have been in Formosa is in fact someone who is making it up because the Jesuits who've been there tell us that this is all made up and that this alphabet is actually copied from the Japanese alphabet. That is the kind of verification that took place. I'm talking about the real case, George Salmanzar, who was kind of fed in London in the early 18th century as a kind of like Formosan from what is Taiwan today, and he became clear of fraud. And then he reinvented himself as a historian. So the capacity for the genre to give authority to the traveler is based on the ability to contrast, compare, and be critical. And that is a crucial aspect of this evolution. Now, how much have I spoken for? I have spoken for 15 minutes. Okay, I have fun. So just to finish this first section, what I have to show is that the study of the impact of travel writing upon European intellectual culture can help explain the origins of the Enlightenment by combining the methods and interests of the historian of ideas with those of the cultural historian. That is to say, by looking not just at the ideas, but also the cultural practices. That is kind of the methodology and motivation. Now, in the rest of my talk, I'm going to sketch the specific arguments that the book does chapter by chapter. So each paragraph is a chapter. So if you have questions, then you should trust. You're meant to have questions.
You have 25 minutes.
So what I do first is to examine the way travel writing functioned as a genre in early modern Europe. And here, one important point is that if we look only at individual travelers like Marco Polo, who go and observe, describe, we are only looking at a small part of the corpus of ethnography that was produced in the period. A lot of it was produced in the form of manuscript letters and reports, what people often call relations, the important genre in the period. And this was a descriptive genre that was considered the building blocks for history, so that the historian used the relations as information to write about, let's say, the Portuguese Empire in India, or about the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Then we need to consider also the work of missionaries, who often were not writing directly for scientific purposes, but just in order to build the information base they needed to convert people to another religion. This is especially clear in the case of the Americas, where missionaries studied closely the religion and the culture of, let's say, the Aztecs, Mexico, not because they thought it was a valuable culture in itself, but because they felt they needed to understand it in order to fight against idolatry and implant Christianity. However, all these kinds of sources had an impact, often through travel collections, which is a very important element of the cultural transformation, that people began in the early 16th century, especially from the middle of the 16th century, to have huge compilations of travel accounts. The most important in the 16th century is by a Venetian, Giovanni Ramusio, Navigazioni Viaggi, in 3 huge volumes. He basically put together all the most authentic descriptions of India, China, Africa, and the Americas, or the new areas discovered by Europeans, also the north of Europe. Going to what Russia was considered part of the new world and discovered, of course. And then works of geography and history were closely connected to these travel collections. Travel collections were understood to provide the materials for world history. Now, when we do global history today, we're doing world history. We could discuss what's the difference between the two of them. Perhaps global is more emphatically about the interactions and the connections, but on the whole, people began to build a new vision of world history in the early modern period. And that vision of world history was often, very often built upon the compilation of travel accounts. Because it provided the information you needed. Where else would you go? So the obvious point is that a huge deal of ethnography and natural history were made available. Many of the things remained in manuscript. And in that respect, it is important to distinguish what was available and what was only available to very few. Another, of course, important consideration is that some texts were edited. That is to say, what was published is not necessarily what was written by the observer. And in this example, I mean, in this sense, you look, for example, at Rousseau. I mentioned Rousseau and the Hottentots. It's a perfect example of someone who doesn't read the best accounts. He reads the summary of a good account by Peter Cole, which is then summarized in England and then translated into French. And he could even have read a much better French account, the translation he didn't. He looked for the kind of like the more popular available book he had on his shelf. So there are issues there about how the knowledge produced by the observers was transformed, edited, and ended up being used by the philosophers. It was not a direct influence. And in that respect, it is important, therefore, to say that the greatest philosophical insights did not necessarily come from the most accurate observations. There is an element of fictionalization in the whole process. So when we say that travel writing was important for the Enlightenment and for the cosmopolitan ideas of the Enlightenment, we're not saying that it was an accurately reflected cultural diversity. I would say that some of the best accounts, the best ethnographies, the ones that were more respectful of local languages and local realities, didn't make it. Nevertheless, there was this global transformation of the way you wrote about world history. There was an idea that you had to be very global. That is kind of the other point. So this is kind of how it functioned as a genre. The next point I want to talk about is how ethnography was used. And in that respect, there are two important poles to kind of great focus of attention. One is the idea of the savage, and the other one is the idea of the civilized who's not European. These are the two poles. Historians have had a tendency to work on one or the other. I think that we need to consider both together in order to do justice to the process. In relation to the idea of the savage, a number of specific groups played a very important and disproportionate role, in fact, in specific moments. In the 16th century, it was the Brazilian Tupinambá that were the most influential. Gentile, those of you who are Gentile, he's a kind of Brazil, the second half of the 16th century. It was an emblematic text. There were, of course, also the Algonquians of North America, Algonquian tribes of North America. In this respect, although there were some important English writings, for example, by Thomas Harriot, an early account in the 1880s of Virginia, the most influential texts were produced by Jesuits in New France, in Canada, in the early decades of the 20th century, in relation especially to the Hurons. Then the Caribs of the Caribbean were also very influential, especially in the 17th century, in the writings of the Dominican Duterte and others. The Hottentots, or the Khoikhoi, to be more respectful, in South Africa, of course the word they used at the time, were also very, very important in the turn of the 18th century, the beginning of the Enlightenment, so they had a big influence in that respect. And finally, in the late Enlightenment, the Pacific peoples, especially the Indians, described by Bougainville, James Cook, and other travelers. These specific groups happened to have a disproportionate effect. there were a number of images of savages, positive and negative, that were built around these peoples. And interestingly, many of these peoples collapsed demographically and disappeared as distinct ethnic cultural groups within decades of the time they were observed. So that there is an interesting, well, dramatic, tragic contrast, in fact, between the literary and iconic afterlife and their real life. They are lasting, the images are lasting the realities. The key thing in relation to savages was that they were used very much to think about how men were naturally before civilization. One of the key debates of the Enlightenment is the nature of civilization, and the image of the savage was essential to that debate. What do we mean by saying that we're civilized? Are we naturally civilized? Are we naturally social or not? And the political philosophy of the 17th and 18th century is often built upon the idea of a natural state that gives way to social contract. And of course, the image of how that natural state was like was essential to interpreting the process by which the contract was achieved and its nature. Very simplistically, you have Thomas Hobbes arguing for men being naturally enemy of men, wolves to men, living in fear, brutal, nasty, short kind of life. And then we have Rousseau questioning that and saying, well, civilization corrupts us too. We lose things that were good by becoming civilized. In the 18th century, all this comes together in the debate about natural sociability and sympathy, the capacity for sympathy, which becomes the cornerstone of the model, for example, of Adam Smith. So there is clearly a very important story here where the image of the savage is crucial. I'll leave it there because, of course, this is 100 pages of manuscript, just like 5 months. What is the other end of the spectrum? The other end of the spectrum is the idea of that the civilized didn't have to be Europeans. You had, for example, in the Americas, the Mexicans, the Peruvians were obviously not the same as those who who were considered to be cannibals. And the Spaniards themselves, when they were arguing about the legitimacy of conquest, the big debate that took place in Spain in the 16th century about how legitimate it was for the Spanish to go and conquer, which is a debate that began in Spain before it became part of the Black Legend, through the writings of Bartolomé de las Casas. That debate was largely conditioned by the observation that not all Americans were at the same degree of barbarism, or in other words, the same degree of civility. That some of them were able to have civil institutions that were comparable to those of Greeks and Romans. And therefore, as Casas, for example, argued, they should be allowed to be independent kingdoms rather than be subjected to empire. They could be taught Christianity. He was a missionary after all, but he didn't believe that it was right to do it the way that we taught. That was a specific debate where the idea that there was civilization within barbarism, there were degrees of civility and barbarism became central. This became even more clear in the case of Japan and China. When the Jesuits began to proselytize there, they were in a situation of saying, well, there's no way we can conquer these kingdoms. We shouldn't try, but we couldn't even succeed. But we really need to do something else. We need to persuade them to become Christian. How are we going to do that? Well, by taking seriously their culture, learning their languages, and in the case of China, famously in the case of China, accepting their philosophy as something valid, in the same way as Christianity was made compatible with Stoicism and with Platonic ideas in the fathers of the Church. The Jesuits argued we should make Christianity compatible with Confucianism. So that meant taking seriously the literary traditions of other civilizations that were not European, learning Chinese, writing books in Chinese. The missionaries, the Jesuits in China wrote in Chinese He also wrote in Tamil in South India. He also wrote in Japanese in Japan. So one key idea here, therefore, is the idea of a Gentile civilization. And of course, there had been that idea already in medieval Europe in the form of ancient Rome before the time of Christianity, in the form of Egypt, in the form of Greece. However, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the idea becomes not something to look back in the past, but something to consider in the present, something that exists out there, everywhere we look, especially in Asia. And then, of course, there were the great Islamic empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, which were a distinct concern. And here we observe an interesting evolution. In the 16th century, in the 15th century, in the early 16th century, the Ottomans, for example, were a great threat. They were a threat to Christianity and they were a threat to European civilization. The two were conflated. By the 17th century, Europeans feel more confident militarily and economically. They begin to look at the Ottomans less as a threat and more as an object of curiosity. And they begin to consider whether we are talking about a different kind of oriental civilization. So it begins with Orientalism as kind of like an intellectual concern. An Oriental civilization that's possibly decadent, but also is culturally peculiar. And many travel to say, well, I'm going to the Ottoman Empire in order to discover what is peculiar about that kind of civilization, which is not like ours. So the idea that civilizations can be different. Finally, another point worth mentioning is that there were Christian kingdoms that were not considered to be European. In Africa, of course, the case of Ethiopia is very important, very influential in the 16th and 17th centuries. In Europe itself, but at the edges of Europe, there was Asia. Russia was an example for centuries considered as a non-European Christian kingdom, a barbarian Christian kingdom. So what all this points towards is the break of the connection between the civilized and the Christian. You have Christians who are not civilized like us, you have Muslims who have a different kind of civility, and then you have all these Gentiles who are civilized, and in some cases as civilized as we are, or even more. All of this creates a fundamental tension within European culture in relation of how you connect religion and civilization. That is one of the key elements of the Enlightenment, the criticism of religion as the cornerstone of civilization. Okay. 5 minutes. Now, very quickly then, which are these debates of the Enlightenment? Well, the debates of the Enlightenment that I'm talking about, first of all, the way natural law was used to justify colonial imperialism or not. So all the debates about empire and about international law in relation to empire were often shaped by the consideration of the status of non-Europeans, the rights, and what are the rights of Europeans in relation to non-Europeans. There was, of course, a Spanish debate in Puerto, but then there was a new version of the debate in Northern Europe, mediated by Hugo Grotius and Samuel Pufendorf and others. The other great debate I've mentioned in passing, but is crucial, is the idea of despotism. The idea that you have, yes, Oriental civilizations, but the system of civil and political liberty that exists in Europe cannot be found elsewhere. That most Oriental states are flawed by their despotism. Now that is very much an Aristotelian concept to begin with, but as I have shown in one of the articles I mentioned on Bernier and his impact on Montesquieu, the actual analysis of the Mughal case, or of the Ottoman case, or of the Safavid case in Persia were very important in formulating that idea. And then the next big debate that is absolutely crucial is the one about how do we write world history? And I'll end up talking about this. In effect, Europeans ended up rewriting their own understanding of world history in the period. They began with a world history that had the book of Genesis as its foundation stone, and they ended up with a new world history which questioned biblical chronology and which used the history of China, India, in order to question the chronology. A world history that questioned the orthodox understanding of the history of idolatry and its role. I haven't spoken much about this, but that's something that if you're interested we can discuss later. That is to say, the question of whether atheism is natural or not, whether religion is natural or not, what is natural religion. There were specific debates, for example, the origin of American Indians. If they are fully human, they must be connected genetically to the rest of mankind. How are they connected? But that also led to questions about how do we analyze those connections in history. For example, can we make linguistic comparisons in order to reach an idea of who are these people related to? Or should we look at customs? So ethnography and linguistic analysis became crucial to rewriting of history, comparative linguistics. All of this well before we have the British Orientalists like William Jones. He's just doing something that's been built up over many decades. And just to tell you finally, how do we explain human diversity when we put aside the question of religion, which had been the fundamental way of describing cultural diversity in the Middle Ages? Once we remove the religious identity as the foundation for describing diversity, what do we look at? Climate, one of the key issues of the period, climatic determinism, impact on climate, understood not just on the weather, but just the temperament of the land, on human diversity. Race, is race important? Well, it begins to be not just important. I would argue that race becomes especially important in the late 18th century and in the early 19th century, say the late 18th, early 19th century. It acquires new significance. Why then and not before? That is an important question. And just generally, I think what you end up with in the Enlightenment is a new kind of universalism built upon a cosmopolitan ideal that took the history of Europe, really, as the exceptionality of the history of Europe as the foundation for a new global history. And that is something that I wish I had more time to talk about, because I really wanted to devote more time to it, but I do feel that I've done enough. But let me say that simply just that that when we reach writers such as Immanuel Kant, who is perhaps one of the philosophers who formulates the idea of a new cosmopolitan ideal, and the imperial, he didn't believe in empires, he believed in federalism, in all the whole world come together. He's not an imperialist, but he is Eurocentric. He believes that European history does have a unique trajectory that gives civil and political liberty, and that therefore there are different civilizations, but none is like Europe. That's kind of his conclusion. And that a world civilization will have to be built upon expanding the European Enlightenment as well. Now, whether that is still our agenda or not, that is what I leave for you to tell me. Thank you very much.